you're part of it, and I carry out my part. I did exactly what you told me to do. I'm gonna keep her stalled with trophy. Every time I hear a siren, I think they're coming for me.
This is Erica Stefanko, and despite her best efforts to hide her face from the world, the person that she could never outrun was herself. It all started with a late-night pizza order, and it would end with not one, but 3 lives over, 2 behind bars and 1 in the grave. However, what really happened that night and in the weeks, months and years after is actually far darker than it first appears. And at the center of it all is one of the most despicable stepmothers that you're ever likely to hear about. What happened to Ashley was brutal enough on its own, but the deeper that police dug, the more ugly it became. Because this case isn't only about murder, but it's also about resentment, custody, jealousy, and control. And 2 people who decided that if Ashley wasn't going to back down, well, they would just remove her instead. And honestly, when you hear how this murder unfolded and what actually happened afterwards, you will realize that the cruelty in those small details are almost as horrifying as the murder itself. Before we begin, and just to let you know that I post true crime, strange and dark stories here weekly, so if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. It really helps the channel out. And now with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Ashley Biggs. Howdy from Ohio, folks, and yeah, we're back here once again. I won't spend too long setting the scene here because Ohio has already made itself more than comfortable on this channel. I mean, at this point, it's basically a recurring cast member here. But Akron, like many other American cities, is the sort of place where life follows a rather familiar rhythm. It's all about work, family, errands, and late-night takeout. The people here are all just people at the end of the day, just simply trying to get through the week and mind their own business. Which is exactly why what happened on the night of June the 20th, 2012 feels so unsettling, because it all began with something that's so painfully ordinary, a pizza delivery. It was very late that evening, and shortly before closing time, that a local Domino's received an order for a half mushroom, half pepperoni pizza. The address in question was 647 West Turkeyfoot Road, which was a commercial property that was only a few minutes drive away from the actual Domino's store itself. Now, nothing about this order stood out to the staff. I mean, of course, it was late, sure, but there was nothing unusual about it. And, at least for the staff, it looked as if it was just one final quick run before the night was over. The assigned driver for this delivery was 25-year-old Ashley Biggs, who, at the time, was working at Domino's to support herself and her ongoing custody battle over her young daughter. We'll get to that part in just a moment, but Ashley was known as dependable, hardworking, and very serious about her responsibilities. In fact, even her manager, Matthew Travis, would later describe Ashley as his best employee at the time, and the sort of person that you don't normally worry about because she was usually the one making sure that everything else ran smoothly. So, when Ashley failed to return from what should have been an ordinary 10-minute job, everybody noticed. Now, at first, it was the kind of concern that you try to explain away. Maybe she got delayed, or maybe she had stopped to answer her phone. However, as the minutes passed by, that concern grew heavier. And concerningly, when Matthew tried to call her, there was no answer. Matthew decided to wait a while longer until eventually, after around 20 minutes of waiting, he made the decision to lock up and then drive to the delivery address himself. You know, just to make sure that everything was alright. However, when he arrived, the entire lot was both dark and quiet. Too quiet for someone who was supposed to be tucking into a delicious deep dish. The business appeared to be empty and vacant too. However, in the middle of the parking lot, he found something. It was a large pool of blood. Not a smear or a few drops, but a huge puddle. The kind of sight that instantly tells you that whatever had happened here was violent, fast, and very, very wrong. Matthew backed away and then called the police, which for time's sake was 12:45 in the morning. And by the time officers arrived, they realized that this was definitely not some sort of missing persons case. There were very clear signs of a struggle here, including blood on the pavement, cash scattered on the floor, and even pieces of a taser that were found. However, there was no sign of Ashley or her car. And when they found a trail of blood nearby, they realized that it stopped quite abruptly too, almost as if she was overpowered, dragged, and then forced into a vehicle, probably her own because hers was missing. They also found a distinct set of tire marks, which of course suggested a quick escape. I mean, whoever this person was, they clearly were in a hurry. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you that none of this was looking good for Ashley, because she had essentially vanished into the night when all she was trying to do was deliver pizza. So, what was the explanation? Well, before we get any further, I think we should first take a look at Ashley and who she was before figuring out what precisely happened. Born on January the 9th of 1987, Ashley Biggs was from the Akron and New Franklin areas of Ohio and was raised by her mother, Kimberly Ann Biggs, and stepfather, Tim Griebenstein. Friends and relatives would describe her as a kind-hearted, energetic, loyal, and deeply protective person. She was also a US Army veteran, similar to last week's video, and this is something that she took great pride in and would never let friends forget. Now, I want you to remember this part moving forward, but she wasn't somebody who was drifting through life without direction, but someone who was stable and had purpose. And more than anything, she wanted to build a better life for her daughter. But unfortunately, that part of her life came with poison. It was several years prior that Ashley had been in a relationship with a man named Chad Cobb, and by all accounts, it was not a healthy one. The relationship between Chad and Ashley was on and off, unstable, and eventually even turned violent. And so, as a result, after he pleaded guilty to domestic violence against her, she filed for a protective order against him. So, even this early in the story, you can already see a pattern emerging here. And the breakup between Ashley and Chad was not over petty bitterness, but actual abuse. Now, despite their relationship ending, Ashley would first become pregnant with Chad, and in the year 2006, she gave birth to their daughter, Grace. This, of course, would completely change the dynamics of her relationship, not only with Chad, but even with herself. Yet, even still, Ashley had ambitions to serve in the military, and in 2007, she decided to enlist in the US Army. It was because of those circumstances, and because her life was in a more transitional phase, that custody of Grace ended up with Chad. Though I do have to say here that most of the practical child rearing was also supported by his parents. Even still, Ashley never stopped caring about her daughter, and as the years went on, that bond became her central issue. Military service was very important to her, but then again, so was being a mother. And so she eventually decided to leave the reserves and instead focus on creating a life where she could be present for her daughter. That was part of the reason why she took the job at Domino's. Working here offered flexible hours, steady income, and would even help her fund the legal fight that she was now in. And I say the legal battle because by the year 2011 and into 2012, Ashley was now pressing to regain custody of Grace. And unfortunately, this is where the story gets darker. By now, Chad had moved on to a new relationship with a woman named Erica Lyon, later known as Erica Stefanko, so for simplicity, we're just gonna call her Erica. Now, between Chad and Erica, they had Grace, which of course was Chad's biological daughter, 2 other children which belonged to Erica and her previous relationship, and an additional 2 children that they both had together. So, with 5 children in the home, it's safe to say that this was a very busy house. It is also worth saying that, with all of this responsibility, Chad was always in and out of work too, meaning that he would often do manual labor for money, but would also routinely lean on family support to stay afloat. In the meantime, Ashley seemed to have learned a few things about her own sexuality, because now she was in a relationship with another woman named Brittany Dunson, and together they believed that Grace would be way better off living with them rather than Chad and Erica. And whether the other two agreed with that or not, the result would always be the same, of course, that being a custody battle, one that unfortunately would become increasingly difficult and bitter over time. So, I'd like to point out the difference between these two parties here because there certainly is one. But to Ashley, this was more about the welfare of her daughter and her own rights as a mother. But to Chad and Erica, it was something far more resentful. Almost like it was all about control. It appeared that Ashley really was a thorn in their backside, because after being out of the picture for a while, she was no longer just this ex anymore, but a problem who kept coming back. And how dare a mother try to protect her daughter from an abusive father, right? Back in the parking lot that night, officers were very busy trying to figure out what on earth happened here. Meanwhile, other officers contacted all of Ashley's loved ones, and you can imagine how distraught Brittany was in that moment. Who, by the way, was very quickly ruled out as a suspect. However, when Brittany got talking to detectives about who might have a grudge against Ashley, well, you can imagine how quickly Chad's name came up. As you can imagine, the police were desperate for answers here, and so they very quickly expanded their search not only for Ashley, but her vehicle too. And then, it was shortly after sunrise that they found something in a cornfield. Found just outside of Chippewa Township and around 20 minutes away, police officers found her vehicle. It appeared to have been driven off the road and then left among the crops, almost as if whoever had dumped the car simply wanted it out of sight. When officers approached the vehicle and then looked inside, what they found, they were met with the outcome that they had feared from the beginning. Ashley was in the back, stone cold, dead. They noted that her body had been left sprawled across the rear footwell, with her arms and legs bound with industrial zip ties, and another zip tie tightly around her neck. Her face was a deep purple hue, and it was obvious that she had in fact been strangled. And as for that missing taser, the wires were still attached to her body. The interior of the vehicle was completely drenched with blood, with the Domino's delivery bag still sitting on the front seat. I have to say that that detail gets me every time in a case like this. Not because it's bizarre or abstract, but because it's always the ordinary stuff that reminds you just how normal Ashley's night had been merely seconds before her murder. It became clear that this was not random chaos, but actually an ambush instead. It looks like whoever did this had lured her to that location, took her out with a taser, restrained her, strangled her, and then dumped her in her own car. But of course, and as always, there was far more going on here than anyone initially realized. So it's no surprise to realize that by now, the police had even more of a reason to speak to Chad, and so they made the decision to head on over to his property. Or I should say his grandparents' home, because despite having 5 children, he didn't actually have his own yet. However, after getting there, well, they realized that Chad was nowhere to be found. So, officers used this time to search not only the property, but the surrounding area too. And after looking over one of the fences, they found a bag of industrial zip ties which looked exactly the same as the ones found on Ashley's body. And when officers searched the woodland behind the property, they found something even stranger. It was Chad hiding in the bushes. And as it turns out, they'd actually found him before he even had the chance to clean himself up, because his clothes were covered in Ashley's blood. Which I have to say is definitely not the look that you want when you're currently suspected over somebody's murder. Now, trust me, there is actually way more to this story than you currently see, but let's first get through this initial part. Moving forward, Chad was taken into custody and faced overwhelming evidence. There was a motive, a history of domestic violence, the zip ties, the bloody clothes, and, you know, the fact that he was hiding from officers, which practically screams guilty. So, it's no surprise to learn that eventually Chad started talking. And what he ended up admitting to the officers was nothing short of horrifying. He told the investigators that he lured Ashley to the empty parking lot using a fake Domino's order, and once she arrived, he attacked her with a taser, beat and strangled her using an industrial zip tie, and then bound her arms and legs before forcing her into the back of her own car. He then drove to a cornfield, dumped the car and the body, and then made his way home. It was a brutal, deliberate, and deeply personal murder. Being faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Chad eventually accepted a plea deal, and in 2013, he pleaded guilty to a long list of charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, aggravated robbery, felonious assault, retaliation, tampering with evidence, gross abuse of a corpse, possession of criminal tools, and domestic violence, which I have to say is probably the longest list of charges that I have ever read out. He was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and considering what Ashley had been through, well, that was the bare minimum outcome that any person would hope for. So, at this stage, you might think that the case is effectively over. I mean, Ashley's killer was caught, he had confessed, and he is now in prison for life. Case closed, right? Well, the thing is, it wasn't. And that's because there was still one detail about this case that detectives still couldn't quite figure out. If we go right to the beginning of this story, you'll remember that somebody had called Domino's that night to place that pizza order. But the thing is, whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't a man, but a woman. And let's just say that that voice would become one of the most important clues to the entire story. Now, I'm quite confident in saying this, but I don't believe that Chad has the vocal range to sound like a lady, which means that he must have had help that evening. But who and why? Well, the more that detectives started looking into this case and the ongoing custody battle, there was one person that kept coming back into focus. And that was Erica. Not only was she the one living with Chad and raising 5 children with him, but she was also standing alongside him during the entire bitter custody battle over Grace. Friends and relatives had already spoken about her hostility towards Ashley too. Not only did she openly resent her and criticize her, but she would also insert herself into the custody battle in a way that went far beyond passive support for Chad. In other words, this was not a woman who was politely standing by her man, but someone who was deliberately trying to inflame the entire situation. However, at least at this point in the investigation, they still had no way of telling if Erica was actually involved or not. And as for Chad, well, he was saying nothing. All he wanted to share with officers that he had done all of this on his own. As far as he was concerned, he acted alone, and all of this was his own doing. To gloss over a few details here, Chad went to prison, Erica divorced him, and from the outside, it looked like she had simply moved on. But the thing is, that so-called moving on period would actually have its own suspicion too. The truth is that a lot of people around Erica realized that she didn't seem too bothered about Chad's imprisonment. In fact, she didn't even care that Ashley was murdered. And then, only 2 years after he was sentenced, she was married yet again. And it doesn't end there either, because as it turns out, the man that she would go on to marry was one of Chad's childhood best friends, and his name was Mike Stefanko. Which, let's be honest, was really going to piss Chad off. In fact, behind the scenes, detectives would realize that she was actually having an affair with Mike while Chad was still a free man. And meanwhile, in the aftermath of all of this, Grace, of course being Chad's and Ashley's daughter, was growing up with all of this around her. And unfortunately, this is where the story becomes devastating. So, to properly set the scene here, not only was most of Grace's life shaped by this custody battle, but she'd also lost her mother to murder, and lost her father to, well, being in prison for it. And so she likely felt all kinds of guilt on the inside. But the truth is that it would not end after her father's sentencing, because Erica resented her for it. In fact, she hated Grace so much that she would insult her, abuse her, and even force her to eat dog poop. And I wish it wasn't true, but this won't be the last time that poop comes up in this video. As you can imagine, that information would eventually make its way back to Chad in prison, and you can probably guess how he felt about it. Now, of course, Chad is a monster himself, but for his partner to leave him for his friend while simultaneously abusing his daughter, well, Erica went from lover to demon in an instant. And so, Chad decided to hatch a plan. From behind the bars of his very own cell, he would send a letter to Detective Michael Hitchings. And in that letter, he admitted something that they had long felt was true, that not only did Erica know about the murder, but she was also part of it too. It turns out that not only was she actually the one to place the Domino's order using a burner phone, but she had also driven him to the parking lot, and then later picked him up after he abandoned Ashley's car in the cornfield. In other words, Erica knew about the murder before, during, and after it all happened. Now, obviously, investigators would have to treat this information carefully. After all, Chad was still a murderer and a liar. But it's also worth noting that at this point, not only did he have nothing to lose, but he was extraordinarily angry at Erica. Even still, investigators would need something stronger than just his confession, and eventually they would get it from inside the family. And it turns out that that would come through his own mother, Cindy Cobb. Now, Cindy is also an interesting character, and it has to be said that she is a rogue in her own right. After hearing about what Erica was doing to her granddaughter, daughter, she was understandably furious. And so, with her son already in prison, she decided that two can play at that game. It was in the year 2014, and after her son had been sent to prison, that Cindy invited Erica around for a drink. But the thing is, Cindy would actually record the entire conversation with Erica without her knowing. And that is when this happened.
Chad said this is what we're gonna do, and this is your part of it, and I carry out my part. I did exactly what you told me to do. I'm a super solid trophy. Every time I hear a siren, I think they're coming for me.
Now, this is one of those moments in true crime that feels almost unbelievable, because when people imagine incriminating records, they do tend to picture either panic or pressure. But as you can hear, Erica did not sound haunted by the murder at all. In fact, she sounded quite comfortable. She described placing the pizza order, dropping Chad off before the murder, and even picking him up. She would even go on to mention that Chad had talked about keeping Ashley's skull as a trophy. She would also mention something that is all too commonly reported among murderers, that every time she heard a police siren, she feared that it would be for her. Now, despite this crazy footage, the arrest still wouldn't happen overnight, because investigators would have to build their case properly and thoroughly. And there is also the fact that Cindy would decide to sit on this recording for many, many months. But eventually, in November of 2019, and nearly 7 years after Ashley was murdered, detectives believed that they finally had what they needed, and Erica Stefanko was arrested for her role in the murder. Erica's first trial would begin in late 2020, and unfortunately I do say first trial because there were many more frustrations to come. As you would expect, the prosecution had a lot of evidence behind them. But of course, one of the most important articles here was the secret recording with Cindy Cobb. That recording was gold dust to prosecutors, and it's no surprise that it's something that Erica and her defense team thoroughly hated. Because, to be honest with you, how do you even walk away from that one? The recording was only part of it, however, because other witnesses were also called to help. And the most painful testimony in the entire case would come from Grace.
I remember Erica making the phone call. It was her voice, and she used a different name to order, and I remember it was a pizza, but I don't remember what she ordered on it.
Grace then went into graphic detail about how Stefanko abused her as a child.
There was an incident where Erica had put dog feces, it was in blueberry yogurt, and told me to eat it, and I noticed that that was in there, and I haven't ever liked blueberry yogurt since then.
Many years had passed by now. Grace was no longer the 6-year-old child who was caught in the middle of a horrible custody battle. Instead, she was a teenager who was now old enough to understand far more of what had happened that night. And of course, she recognized the roles that both Chad and Erica had played. Surprisingly, Grace remembered being in the car with Erica on the night that her mother was murdered. She remembered Erica calling Domino's, placing the order for the exact kind of pizza, and even the fake name that she used. Being only 6 years old at the time and out late, she would fall asleep shortly after, which means that she doesn't actually remember what happened to her mother in the exact moments that she was murdered. However, she does remember waking up the next morning in her great-grandparents' home. I have to say though, fair play to her, because I hardly remember anything at 6 years old. Grace's memory is really good. But I guess in a way it's also kind of a curse, because she remembers everything about the day that her mother was murdered, and that she was so helpless to all of it. The court also heard about Erica's treatment of Grace, including how she'd physically abused her, singled her out in the household, and even ridiculed her. And that evidence would help paint an even scummier picture of Erica. As we know, Chad Cobb also testified against her. And yes, there is something grimly absurd about a convicted murderer taking the stand to help convict somebody else. But I do have to say, yet again, I just love to see two monsters turning on each other like desperate animals. The peculiar thing here is that Chad did not testify in exchange for any reduced sentence or secret benefit, which meant that, in short, the jury could rely on his words not being spoken out of greed, but purely out of truth. And if you ask me, after hearing about how she was treating Grace and how she went with one of his best friends behind his back, well, I think he just really wanted to see Erica burn. Chad was a murderer without any large motive to lie. Grace was a child with many traumatic memories, and Cindy's recording was a secret tape that revealed the truth. And combined, they were enough to take her down. It's no surprise to learn that during court proceedings, Erica tried to present herself as a softer version of her actual character. At one point, she even said that she was her worst self during her relationship with Chad, and that she had never been a hateful person before. But I'm just going to stop you there, Erica, because honestly, you're foul. It was also revealed that after Ashley was murdered and then eventually laid to rest, Erica would even admit to friends that she visited her grave and shat on it. What a genuinely deplorable thing to do. Once all was said and done, the jury deliberated for a total of 3 days before returning with a verdict, and in the end, they found Erica Stefanko guilty in connection with Ashley's murder. As a result, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. So, at this stage, it did seem that the second half of justice had finally been served. But sadly, that was not the end for Erica. In the year 2022, she appealed, and surprisingly, her conviction was overturned, which resulted in a retrial. Now, of course, that does not mean that she was declared innocent. However, it did give her a second fighting chance. In 2024, she was retried for Ashley's murder. But thankfully, the new jury reached the same essential conclusion, and on January the 31st of that same year, Erica was once again found guilty of aggravated murder, with her life sentence upheld. As things stand, Chad Cobb remains in prison for life without parole, while Erica is serving a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years. Which, of course, may sound like a lot when you think about it, but when you look at all of the years taken away from Ashley, it is just a small price to pay. Those who knew Ashley remember her as funny, driven, loyal, and full of love for her daughter. She was a veteran, a partner, a daughter herself, and most especially, a mother who was trying to fight her way back into her child's life. Ashley was working late-night pizza deliveries not because it was some glamorous dream of hers, but because it was both practical and flexible work that helped her support herself and fight for custody of Grace. And the ordinary future that she so desperately wanted was taken from not only her, but her own daughter too. In the end, Grace was not only left to grow up without her mother and without the chance to know Ashley on her own terms, but without her father too. It is worth saying here that during Erica's sentencing, Ashley's mother Kim would address her directly and would deliver a statement that was cutting, bitter, and frankly earned. In this statement, she said, "I hope you're out of your favorite things in the commissary. I hope when you call home you get to voicemail. I hope when you write home your only pen has no ink and every pencil breaks. And I hope that those around you got to see the real Erica and will remove you from their lives." And honestly, if I were her, I would have added that I hope every pizza she has the fortune of eating in the future tastes like, well, you can guess. The reason why Ashley's case is so unsettling is because a rather ordinary type of conflict would escalate into the most haunting and bizarre of conclusions. And it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous people out there aren't the ones that we don't know, but actually those who are closest to us. The ones that we formerly loved. Now, let's not forget Chad here, because put bluntly, he is both barbaric and stupid. But I think that Erica's level of depravity is especially terrible. So I guess, in a way, they really were a match made in hell. As for Grace, I really do hope that she is doing well wherever she is and whatever she's doing, because these circumstances were thrust upon her and she had no way of controlling it. Anyway folks, I think that covers most of the important details in this case, so I'm going to wrap it up here. However, before I go, I'd love to know your thoughts on this one, because it's an especially depraved case. Please do share your thoughts down below. If you want to find me on social media, go to Coffeehouse Crime on Facebook, Instagram, or Spotify. And if you really want to support me in the channel, please go to classifiedcoffeeco.com to grab yourself a bag of my very own coffee. Thank you. And yeah, I guess that's the end of today's video, folks. As always, I really do appreciate you being here to watch me. Thank you so much for making it to the very end. And I'll see you again very shortly for another video, likely in a week's time. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves and each other, and remember to stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye. I have an announcement to make, but Nero is 9 years old tomorrow. Can you believe that? He has no idea. I can't believe you run a YouTube channel. It's true, folks, all of the decision making comes from this guy.